And welcome again to the Study Bible Study, where we study the Bible with study Bibles. And Revelation 17:14 tells us, "And these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall conquer them, for he is Lord of lords, he is King of kings. And they who are with him are called and chosen and faithful." God bless and amen. And in the words of the late great C.S. Lewis, the Christian does not think that God will love us because we are all good, but that God will make us good because he loves us. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by Christianity, I see everything else. The eyes of a man of God. Now, God allows us to experience the low points in life in order to teach us lessons that we could not learn in any other way. And a just man, the dikaios, equitable in character or act. In a wide sense, upright, righteous, virtuous, a man who keeps the commands of God, a man whose way of thinking, feeling, and acting is wholly conformed to the will of God, and who therefore needs no rectification in the heart of life. A man who is approved and acceptable of God, a man who is such as he ought to be. And welcome back to our communist manifesto, the communism. Okay. Uninterrupted disturbance on social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeoisie epoch from all the earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into the air, and all that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and relations with his kind. It's pretty morbid. But the need of constantly expanding market for the product chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe, the planet. Not the flat earth, but the globe. Because we're on a spinning ball like the Death Star, cruising around a great big circle, circling the sun. Never crashing into the sun, never crashing into another spinning planet. Because it's the perfection of the globular planetary universe created by, I'm guessing, some of these people. But anyways, it must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie, as through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country, the great chagrin of reactionists. It has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. Old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. These are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. Now, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw materials drawn up from the remotest zones, industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of old wants satisfied by productions of the old country, we find new wants requiring for their satisfaction. Now the products of distant lands and climes, the place of old local and national seclusion, of self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal independence of nations, and as in material, so also in the intelligent production, the intellectual creations of an individual nation become common property, unless that property is stolen and reverse engineered and sold back to them at a cheaper price. Unless that, but So the intellectual production, the intellectual creations of the intellectual nations become a common property. National one-sidedness and national narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And from numerous national and local literatures there arises a world literature, a group think of sorts. Now the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production and by immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The wonderful invention of the cell phone, putting it into everybody's hands all over the globe. Thank God the Wi-Fi can go through the ball to the bottom of the globe, so we can Wi-Fi with the people in Australia, opposed to digging a 500-foot hole to dropping a wire through the ball. Oh well. Anyways, back to our manifesto. The manifesto. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery which it batters down all Chinese walls, which with the force, with which it forces barbarians' intently obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations on the pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeoisie mode of production. It compels them to introduce what is called civilization into their midst, to become bourgeoisie in themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. Now the bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of towns. It has created enormous cities. It has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. You stupid rural life living people. You idiocrats. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns. The people in the country cannot survive without the 7-Eleven in the local town and the Little Caesars. We cannot make it. No way. But anyways, and the liquor mart. But actually in the country, every country I know of is actually built around, every country town that I know of is built around a local bar. So there's always a vendor. In the idiocracy of rurality, there is a vendor. Now, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeoisie, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of population of the means of production and of property. It has an agglomerated production. It has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence that was political centralization. Independent but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, and governments and systems of taxation became lumped together in one nation, with one government, one code of laws, one nation, class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scare 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all the preceding generations together. Subjugation of natural forces to man, to machinery, and the application of chemistry, to industry, to agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, the clearing of the whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the river. What earlier century has been. He has even been a presentment of such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor. We see then that the means of production and of exchange, of whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, were generated in feudal society. As a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged Now the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder, and they were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by social and political constitutions adapted to it, and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeoisie class. The institution of rules probably weren't needed to control. Now a similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeoisie society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such a gigantic means of production and exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against the modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions of the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put on its trial each time more threateningly the existence of entire bourgeoisie society. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products but also of the previously creative productive forces are periodically destroyed. These crises there breaks out an epidemic that in earlier epochs would have. What would they have done? They would have seemed absurd. They would have seen an absurdity. The epidemic of overpopulation. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. Now it appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Now industry and commerce seems to be destroyed. And why? Because there too is much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of the bourgeoisie property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered, and soon they overcome these fetters. They bring disorder to the whole of the bourgeoisie. The consumption becomes too much by overpopulation. Now, society and the endangered existence of the bourgeoisie property. Now the conditions of the bourgeoisie society are too narrow to compromise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On one hand, enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, and on the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more through exploitation of old ones, that is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by the diminishing means whereby the crises are prevented. So it's taking away the jobs, I suppose, in a matter of speaking, layman's terms. And this is our Intro to Communism study on the Study Bible study, where we study the Bible with study Bibles. Now, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses. We forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, and deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And Revelation 17:14 tells us, and these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall conquer them. For he is Lord of lords, he is King of kings, and they who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. God bless and amen.